Welcome to the Kolbecast, episode 283. Thank you for joining us. Today, Bonnie and I are joined by professor, author, speaker, and homeschooling father, Dr. Ryan Hanning. In addition to hearing about Dr. Hanning's experience as a homesteader and homeschooling father, we delve into a conversation about virtue and how our natural temperaments influence our life of virtue. There's even more in his book, The Willpower Advantage, but we're able to make a good beginning in today's episode. We hope that you'll enjoy the show.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, Kolbe homeschooling mom of 4 lads and lasses, liturgical musician, popcorn, and podcast fanatic.
And this is Stephen, homeschooling father of 5 and director of development for Kolbe Academy.
Hi, Stephen, how are you?
I'm doing well. It's a Monday morning, so ready to tackle the week.
Yeah, something like that. Sounds good. Can I borrow that? Or tackle
the week.
That kind of like, okay, I'm not quite there yet, but I'll borrow yours. And it's a great way to start the week with a recording.
Yes.
With us today is self-described professor, researcher, speaker, and homesteader, Dr. Ryan Hanning, here to discuss, among other things, a book that he co-authored, The Willpower Advantage, published by Ignatius Press. Hi, Dr. Hanning. Welcome to the Kolbecast.
Hey, good morning. Good morning. And Stephen, as you described tackling the week, a very good football analogy as we kick off the season. So appreciate it.
Yes.
There we go. The more I have learned about you and your work, the more I became convinced that you were someone whom we'd greatly enjoy visiting with and would learn much from. So as we ask of all our guests making their Kolbecast debuts, would you tell us about yourself and your background and such like?
Sure. So most importantly, I'm a father of 10, husband of 1. Our oldest is 24 down to 6. So we run the whole gamut, and we're in that unique stage of life where I feel like we're parenting 2 distinct families as we have our older kids who are married, some getting engaged, working, and then others who are still learning how to put their underwear on before they get to mass. So we're right in the middle of it. But I've had the opportunity to be a professor really for going on, it's hard to imagine, but almost 25 years now. Teaching primarily in the area of theology and philosophy, and primarily in historical theology. So a lot of times just the comparison of big ideas. And that has led me to huge tier 1 research universities where I've had the opportunity to teach humanities over at Arizona State University, all the way to small little private schools, University of Mary. I've done some work over at Franciscan University of Steubenville, and most currently just absolutely enjoying teaching in the Honors College here locally, just north of Nashville, a little college called Austin P, and then helping out our beloved Dominican sisters at the Mother House St. Cecilia's, where I teach their novices as well. So I'm an itinerant professor, more or less, and I run a small farm here just north of Nashville in Jolton, Tennessee, and excited to be with you. And I should mention, we do homeschool all of our 10 children, and so far all are not only alive, but are excelling, and that's in large part credit to my wife. But we've been amazed in the last 25 years now of homeschooling our children, how much the environment has changed, really. Just the resources are available to parents and the opportunities that present themselves, not only just in terms of curriculum and education, but also now even in some of the state support that's being provided across the U.S. So happy to be here, happy to chat about a topic I love and am still learning and perfecting myself, which is growing in the virtues.
Very nice. We are eager to discuss that with you. That's a favorite topic of ours as well. Just a comment on Arizona State. We have had the great blessing of getting to visit with Msgr. Shea and learn about UMary, which is one of Kolbe's college partners. So I was pretty intrigued when he told us about the partnership at Arizona State between that school and UMary. And is that what you were a part of? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So that program launched, the first private partnership of its kind. At the time, I worked for the Diocese of Phoenix and then was asked to take that over and help found that, and had that for 5 years. And now it has just grown under Msgr. Shea's leadership into Mary College now. We're there in the second oldest building on campus, which happens to be the old St. Mary's Church. And we offer Catholic studies and theological studies for students who are at ASU, who can then either do additional classwork and or even a full dual degree through the University of Mary. And then, of course, University of Mary students from Bismarck who might not want to be there during the winter can come down and take classes and avail themselves of an incredible catalog of classes at Arizona State University while still having the benefit of the community there at is what's now called Mary College at Arizona State University. So incredible partnership, incredible leadership under Msgr. Shea. I was happy to be a part of it for well over 5 years as we established that program.
It sounds really neat. Yeah, that's great. And so on your homeschooling side as well, do you have any standout memories or things about your family's homeschooling experience? They could be happy, cautionary, some of both, otherwise, things about homeschooling that stand out to you when you first think about it.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing I've learned, and I'm now trying to apply with my younger children, is it's a lot easier to teach things that you're interested in, right? So my children do a pretty what we call sort of a great books program on steroids. But I'm an Anglophile. I love British literature, both fiction and nonfiction. I had the opportunity to study in England for 8 years for my Ph.D. work, and so I admittedly, I'm probably not going to, read a book that I'm not interested in to my children. But when they bring me, last night, Lord of the Rings, or some Jules Verne or something, I just get super excited about it. So we've tried to create curriculum, at least the way that my wife has involved me in the process, give me opportunities to teach the kids things I'm really interested in, and not to truncate their own learning and exposure, but they get excited then. And if the end of the day, if our goal in our homeschooling is to teach them really a love for learning, and then to cultivate the talent so they can find out what they need to know on their own, right? Then teaching them and just them seeing our own passion for the stuff we teach is really exciting. And so I think that's one of the big takeaways. I wish I knew that sooner, because the first few years we were just teaching what we thought we were supposed to teach, and then we realized later on that we might as well take this opportunity to teach what we know our children need and what we ourselves are very interested in. And then as they get older, they can discover their own talents and interests, and we can support those as well. So. But still learning.
Sure.
Well, after we get this the 6-year-old out to college or trade school or duly employed, we'll let you know how we did.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, I found it very in that experience with like delving into learning with the kids. I found it very interesting that my kids ended up, well, I have 5 that have all been homeschooled, but they expose me to things that I haven't really embraced. And all of a sudden it's like, wow, I see why you're interested in this and why. And so there's been several different areas that I hadn't, didn't have a love of, sort of Revolutionary War history and the figures there. And all of a sudden one of my sons became passionate about it. And so I'm picking up everything and we're having long discussions. It's a really, so when you're getting that, I think even if you haven't completed the race yet, it seems like there's at least some good signs of success. But
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so my conversation this morning with my 12-year-old son was, hey, I'm going to be on, doing an interview, so please don't come down to your forge. So he wanted to do blacksmithing for one of his classes in high school. And so we built out a forge down here. My older son, who is a welder, helped him do it. And so anyway, now we've all found an interest in forging, and we're doing Damascus steel knives, things I would never have thought of.
Wow.
That he has the opportunity to do, and then we all get interested in, which is great.
That is neat. As I mentioned, the more I learned about you, the more connections I realized that we have and various points of shared interest. This particular one being your connection with Fraternus. We had the great joy of visiting with Jason Craig on episode 199. So say a little bit about you and Fraternus.
Yeah, Jason Craig's a dear friend. I've had the opportunity to serve on the National Fraternus Board for about 5 years, and all my sons are involved, myself included in Fraternus. And yeah, really, what an incredible organization. It truly is a brotherhood. It's not a program, no 3-ring binders. Pretty simple. We focus. We meet together weekly, really as men, to support each other, and then to bring young men into that experience. And so, what it usually looks like is a game as dangerous and violent as possible. So usually tackle football, whatever your insurance will allow, but followed by meal and fellowship, and then a king's message, just a brief talk on the virtues, and then to get the young men together with the other men, just to really dive into practically how you apply that virtue, and then we go pray. So pretty simple, and really just to create that environment where men are allowed to really discover what it means to grow in their masculinity, centered in Christ, but built up with each other. And I can tell you, just in my own life, has really been a huge impact for me. A lot of the Fraternus brothers and captains I serve with are my dearest friends. So Jason and the team over Fraternus done a great job, and I'm happy to be a part of it. And it does align too with a lot of what we do with just my own writing with Virtue, and then of course with the homestead and farm up here in Jolton. Jason and I share a lot of notes. Usually, just most of the phone calls are about our failures, but once in a while we'll also call each other with our successes. But raising your own animals and doing all that, if you haven't done it before, is fraught with opportunities for God to increase your virtue of humility, and for you to learn some greater dependence on Him and the land.
Beautiful. It seems like such a neat program.
We have about 50 chapters now, and we're growing, but really, where we grow is places where there's already brotherhood, right? Where there's already men coming together and who already have that community and say, hey, I want to do something for the young men. Then Fraternus is great because it can provide some of that additional structure and training and whatnot to help them do that well. But now we've even launched squads. So you don't have to have a full chapter. You can go on to fraternus.org and actually launch your own squad. I know tons of dads who are doing this with their own sons. And it's kind of 3 courses. What does it mean to be son, father, and brother? And so great resources there. Happy to always plug Fraternus anytime I get a chance to.
Good deal. Well, we'll link that in our show notes so folks can check out more about that. All right. So this book that you co-authored with Tom Peterson has a timelessness to it. Tell us a bit about the Willpower Advantage, maybe the inspiration for it and such things.
Yeah, and we did write it and publish it. So we wrote it before COVID, then switched, made some edits, and then published it during it. So we feel like it kind of got stuck in like a time warp. So some people are just discovering it now. Some people have known about it for a while. But yeah, the inspiration really came out of conversation with myself and Tom Peterson, a great husband, father, Catholic leader, runs Catholics Come Home. We had collaborated really for the last 20 plus years. I would do a lot of the training and research for diocese. And he has a heart of an evangelist, and we'd have these conversations and pray together. And in one of those conversations, we were talking about our own challenges as husband and father, and our own need to grow in virtue. And I'd been teaching classical philosophy and virtue in both secular and private schools, so I knew this stuff intellectually. And I was kind of joking with him, saying, "Yeah, it's great. It lives in my head, but it's hard to get down to my heart." And he goes, "Well, I'm kind of the opposite. Like it's in my heart, but I don't understand it." So we had about 5 or 6 conversations, and really we decided to write a book for ourselves. That's sort of the genesis of it was, let's continue this conversation and think through what does the wisdom of the church have to tell us as husbands and fathers, what it means to grow in virtue. And then from that, it came out like, let's actually write a book. Let's make it consumable for moms, for dads, for sons, for daughters, for everyone, just to walk through the wisdom of the church and kind of in some ways, repackage, or what Tom calls, blue collarize the theology of virtue. It's called eritology, right? The study of excellence, and make it consumable for your average Catholic. And it's been amazing because I still have people come up to me and say, "Hey, I went to Catholic school for 12 years, or I'm very devout, but I never knew this." And I think a lot of times we assume the knowledge of virtue, which used to be part and parcel of the Christian culture, has really been forgotten. And there's some reasons, historical reasons for that. Some that go all the way back to the Enlightenment, others to the Protestant Reformation. But for the large part, we wanted the book to really first and foremost serve us and our call to grow in holiness and grow in virtue, and how we participate with God's grace to do that. And then to hopefully bring the wisdom of the church out in maybe a new way or more practical way to people who may not have discovered or really studied virtue before. So the book was meant to be really practical. It's got things in there like a spiritual audit, which can help you understand your temperament. It's amazing when you look at the saints. Every time they talk about virtues, they also talk about temperament. In fact, they assume that you know yourself, and so that when you're growing in virtue, you kind of have a plan. The way a choleric, for instance, he's motivated by action. The way they grow in prudence, for instance, is much more. They're really good at decision, right? But they're not good at discernment. So when they say they need to grow in prudence, what they really are saying is they need to practice discernment. So we provide this opportunity to give some more additional self-insight, really from the wisdom of the church, and then from there, then we walk through 13 different virtues. And then how to grow in those virtues, really based off your temperament, based off of some of those natural proclivities that God has endowed you with as part of your creation.
I was going to ask about the idea of the temperaments and building that in, but then you answered it right away before. So just to clarify, though, it was kind of from the wisdom of the saints and things, and their inclusion of that, and probably it makes sense. But I hadn't thought about that before picking up your book.
Yeah, it's funny. Once you kind of have that lens, you start seeing it everywhere. And I've had the opportunity to work with Alex Havard. He's also a great scholar on this, and he's done a lot of work on the gift of magnanimity, the virtuous leadership, where he does this. He walks through the temperaments and then does a beautiful job aligning the cardinal virtues and the virtues of humility and magnanimity with your particular temperament and what you might need. And he does this really based off a deep reading of Aquinas. But if you look at Aquinas, St. Francis de Sales, St. Teresa of Avila, St. John Vianney, you will actually find in their writings this all over the place. St. Teresa of Avila, for instance, is writing instructions to when she's older. This is late in life. She's writing instructions to one of the other superiors, and they're saying that they're having trouble in prayer because some of the young women get very excited and are very loud, and then others really need a lot of quiet and a lot of just sort of peacefulness and stillness in order to pray. And St. Teresa's led her back to her saying, well, look, that's because some of the women among you are naturally choleric. They're naturally motivated by action. And you have some of you that are choleric sanguine. And she goes, they're very difficult because they're motivated by action and fun and adventure. And so she's giving advice based off of, hey, how do you approach the virtues for that group versus other groups? So you really do, Stephen, start to find it really beautifully woven out throughout the wisdom of the saints, because it's part of our sort of Greco-Roman patrimony that we inherited and baptized as Christians. So, it predates Christianity, goes all the way back to, Hippocrates and his study of the four humors and how he kind of theorized. And I think it stands the test of time. Good developmental psychologists, even if they reject temperament theory, tend to still agree with the reality that some people naturally react quickly to things and naturally have more sustained energy, which would be more choleric. Some people react quickly to things but are more ephemeral. They can move on very quickly. That'd be me. I'm a high sanguine. I love people. I love starting adventures. My homestead is essentially dozens of projects that I have started but I have not finished, right? Because I'm really good at starting things, but what I need is perseverance. I need that component of courage, right? I have great audacity. I can start things, but I need perseverance. And St. Thomas, when he talks about courage, says you need both, right? Or if you're kind of slower to react, and have a more sort of stable and sustained reaction, we call that melancholic, right? Sort of slow, deep, pervasive. But then if you're sort of slow but ephemeral, slow and can move on, the term is phlegmatic. That means that you're more like engineering, more practical, very diplomatic. So in the book, we kind of walk through each of these temperaments and the temperament combos and wisdom from the saints and also from the scriptures about how to then grow and how to sort of come up with a plan to grow in the virtues you need most. The virtues are going to bring you life and joy, and simultaneously counteract then those vices that will rob you of your peace and joy.
I love talking about the temperaments. My father gave me the Bennett's book, The Temperament God Gave You. So we actually got to visit with them, episode 176. Great. And then later about their book on anxiety. So we'll link those for folks to catch. The
Bennetts are great. We cite them in the book, and we highlight in the back of the book, definitely the Temperament God Gave You is a great book to help discern and sort of do the work of really discerning your own temperament. The Temperament God Gave Your Spouse, we always joke, the subtitle should be, 5 easy ways to a great fight, because those conversations are going to be difficult. And then the Temperament God Gave Your Children is also very good. So the Bennetts are excellent. So in some ways, we're building off of the great work of Alex Savard and the Bennetts and others, and just trying to create something a little bit more practical in the sense of, and we always tell people, pick up the book. If you already done some thoughts, you might know which virtue you really need, and then focus on that chapter and think about considering your temperament. Because I've met a lot of people, and when I say a lot, probably in the thousands when I go give lectures or even at the university, where they'll come to me and they'll say, hey, my entire life, I've really struggled with initiating activity. I'm very timid. I'm naturally introverted. I have trouble, talking to people. And so I've really been praying, for God to just infuse this in my heart. And we're like, well, of course God could work that way. And God does work that way. But if I pray every day to be a great violinist and I never pick up a violin, I can't be mad at God when I don't know what I'm doing, right? So in much the same way with virtue, we need to constantly practice it. And so in that case, if you're struggling with audacity, well, let's triage it. Are you, if you're phlegmatic, most likely the case, if you describe yourself as very timid, or maybe it's on the other side that you overthink things and you're more on the melancholic side. Well, the way you're going to approach audacity is going to be very different based off of your temperament. So the book tries to parse some of this out in an easy, bite-sized way. Tom and I say we make a great partnership because I'm the theologian. I kind of think in more like classical terms. He's just the blue collar evangelist, and so together we were able to bring things together without watering down any of the wisdom of Aquinas or Saint Teresa of Avila or Saint Francis de Sales or others, but at the same time, making it consumable and something that's eminently practical in terms of growing these particular virtues.
It's definitely that. I really enjoyed it. I love how you bring the temperaments together with the virtues. And also acknowledge, we say this every time we talk about the temperaments, like these are not like black and white. Here's your temperament. Okay, good luck. Like you're stuck there. That's not an excuse or some kind of sentence or anything like that. Like this is kind of how you're naturally wired, but you also are responsible for growing in virtue. So, and here's how you can approach it. So I appreciate all that.
and I would add too, I mean, really, sometimes it's become a heresy in the life of the church too. And so you have, one side, you're the determinist, which would say essentially you are just your temperament. You can't do anything about it. There's really no role for will. There's no role for grace. And this would be more like maybe it's like sort of modern day psychology, which would take your temperament, oh, that's just the way you are, rather than push back against it, give into it, and figure out ways to give into it that are healthy and non-destructive. Well, that'd be very different than sort of the Christian understanding of the human heart and our responsibility to cooperate with grace. But on the other side, you have this voluntarism that says it's all will. There's no temperament. I make myself. My nature doesn't matter. I'm in charge of my own destiny. And that's not appropriate either. And those two things have actually been, determined and described as heresy in the life of the church. Determinism on one hand, which would reject our ability to change, and then voluntarism on the other, which would reject the reality that we're created and have a particular nature and temperament given to us by God. And so the idea, of course, with all things Catholic, it's the both and, right? Well, yeah, we're both, given our temperament, but we're also given grace and a will that allows us to participate with God's plan for us to become the men and women He made us to be.
Say a bit about the term willpower in your title. At one point, you have made reference to reclaiming that term.
Yeah, we kind of put it sort of as a provocative title because in some ways willpower is in some ways in modern parlance tends to mean more voluntarism, tends to mean more like it's my power, it's within my ability, as opposed to sort of a partnership. And but from us, we want to reclaim that word because previously what that word meant was I'll go all the way back to the beginning, right? So in Genesis, when God creates Adam and Eve in his image and likeness, the Hebrew words there are very instructive. The Hebrew words damut and tetzlem literally mean rational intellect and a will. So what makes us most like God is that we have a rational intellect that's able to perceive the world and our place within it, and then a will in which we can choose how to interact and be in relationship with the world around us. So it's those two things that make us most like God. And so what God wants for us then is for our will to mature and develop, and essentially to conform our will to God's will for us, because ultimately that's where our good is, and that's where our ultimate happiness is that we're all looking for. And so that basic understanding all throughout Judeo-Christian history was kind of understood and inferred. And so they would talk about things like the weak will. Well, we meant a weak will. We meant a will that wasn't able to make choices that directed the appetite towards what was good, beautiful, and true. And then when you talked about the strong will, what you meant was the will that ignored and tried to overcome or suppress your nature as opposed to try to partner with it. So very often we would talk about the good will. And you get this sort of term coming out, not directly, but this willpower would focus more about our responsibility to make our will good, the work that's necessary to do to conform our will to God's. And so this sort of classical understanding has been in many ways hijacked. It's been hijacked, to the side of sort of more, and we can get very philosophical if you want, but really that transition happens during Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is going to elevate the unique aspect of the will of man, but because he denies we have any specific nature, then all we are is will. And willpower then takes on a new term, which means our ability to, on our own, to overcome oppression, on our own to overcome those things that impede us. Well, that's actually not the way it works. And many of us, by the time we're 17 or 18, realize that we have tried really hard to do it on our own, and it's just not possible, right? And so when we say willpower, we want to reclaim that word. What we mean is the activity we do to make our wills good, the activity we do to strengthen our will so our will can align with our intellect, not to suppress our appetites, but direct our appetites towards what's good, beautiful, and true. And that kind of image, really is this classical churches understand this is where virtue plays in. So I'll give you a brief description. It's also outlined in more detail in the book, but you'll give you the Cliff Note version. When the great Greco-Roman philosophers thought about the human heart, they really described it that there was this sort of dynamic tension, what Plato would describe as a beam on a fulcrum, a teeter-totter, essentially. And on one side, you have your intellect, that rational aspect, right, those rational powers of the soul. And on the other side, you have your appetitive part, your appetite, your desires. And then in between those things, you have your will. And Plato described it this way. He said, when the will is allied with the intellect, it liberates the appetite. It doesn't destroy them. It actually directs them towards what's good, beautiful, and true. But if the will is allied with the appetite, it actually suppresses the intellect. He actually says it makes you vicious. And the word there, vicious, means you're full of vice. And so the early Christians took that on. So Augustine, Ambrose, others, and used that basic kind of understanding of the powers or faculties of the human soul, this intellect, your will, and your appetite and the interplay between them. And so when Augustine talked about it, it was really beautiful. He borrowed straight from Aristotle. Later, this was codified in much more detailed ways by St. Thomas Aquinas and also by Lombard. But this idea then that essentially the virtue, the cardinal virtue of prudence is meant to naturally perfect your intellect. The cardinal virtue of justice is meant to naturally perfect your will. And then the virtues of temperance and fortitude or courage are actually meant to naturally perfect those two components of your appetite. One that's more immediate, called concupiscible, and one that strains for difficult things, the irascible. And so the four cardinal virtues essentially come to make us excellent, come to help us grow into what we are, to use our faculties in accord with their nature. And then here's the other thing that St. Teresa of Avila adds one other layer to this, and she articulates that the supernatural virtues, the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, supernaturally perfect those things. So faith is a supernatural perfection of our intellect, right? And so it's like this beautiful hope is a supernatural perfection of our will. That we would hope that what we choose could actually bring us to God, would actually be the right choice, would actually lead towards our flourishing and not towards our suffering. And then the supernatural virtue of love is actually meant to perfect our desires, our appetites. And we hear that St. Francis de Sales describes God as the fulfillment of all our desires, right? Quoting Augustine. So this great excitement for both myself and Tom, and I can probably tell I still have, in just teaching really the beautiful wisdom that's been passed on in the life of the church, that I think gives us a very good, almost complete psychology in terms of understanding our own pursuit of virtue and our own pursuit of becoming the men and women God called us to be. And while it's difficult in the sense to align our will with God's, that takes real work, real time, real prayer, real effort, real suffering, real mistakes, real brokenness, real failures, all of that. The concept is not hard to understand. And God has made us for himself. We're going to find fulfillment in him. And the great adventure of life is discovering how God has called us to become the person he's made us to be and to fulfill the unique mission he's given us. And all of that was understood until about 400 years ago. And then it's like, poof, just wiped off the face of education in the West.
And I've been thinking a lot about the idea of happiness, both, well, at a class I'm taking and then, adult faith formation and just my life in general. And I was approaching everything from that Aristotelian idea of happiness is life in accordance with virtue. And then, we had Dr. Andrew Abella on, who has a book called Super Habits, where he kind of summarizes all of the St. Thomas's treatise on the virtues. And you see there how complete it is and how that would kind of have been enough actually right there. But as I talk with people now, we have the idea of virtue, but then it seems like I also have to emphasize the idea of relationship, which would be included in the living a virtuous life, would be having good relationships. And then this idea of having purpose or meaning, so it seems like I think probably because of the deterioration of our understanding of virtue, I kind of have to layer on these other things to make it seem more complete when I'm talking to people today. But
yeah, and there's a really good analog, or somebody who studies this is Walker Percy in his great book, Lost in the Cosmos, the last self-help book. He's tongue-in-cheek. Now he's a trained clinical psychologist who's writing about this, and he makes this really scary proclamation. He says that the essentially the reduction or rejection of virtue is going to lead later towards the rejection of nature, which then we're going to be at battle with ourselves. Right. So if you reject that I have a purpose, if you reject that I can know my purpose, if you reject that even though I'm broken, by God's grace, I can fulfill my purpose with his help, right? Not on my own, but with him. But that I have a role to play in this. If you reduce all that or reject it, the next thing you're going to reduce is that you actually have a purpose, that you actually have a nature, that it's actually possible to be happy. And then all those other, sort of things fill in there. So, I'm always amazed at how kind of timeless these themes are and how much is connected to our own sort of brokenness and often our stupidity. But,
yes.
Because I'm still figuring this out, Stephen, that people come up to me like, oh, hey, I don't know, that they think I can walk on water. And I always tell them, hey, I still yell at my kids and I still kick goats. I have to give them context. So we have milk goats and they're very mischievous. And, sometimes when they get into stuff, I overreact. And so the kids look at me in horror. So I'm still learning this stuff. Is my point.
Sure.
So I'm still growing in virtue too. But you're right, though. The cultural underpinnings the basic understanding of the pursuit of happiness connected to our purpose, and then our purpose connected to our nature, was not confused. It was strained, right? We see it's not like the ancient Romans were holy. I mean, they were a very corrupt society. They were seeking for happiness in all the wrong places as well. But we can see though that over time, the way that ever since the fall, these things have played out. We've gone to a point where we really do need to reclaim this. Alistair MacIntyre in his great book After Virtue makes the case for this too, that a post-virtue world that's lost a sense of purpose is going to lose a sense of nature. And as a church, we need to reclaim this, because ultimately this is part of the good news. The Second Vatican Council fathers explain it this way. They say, Jesus came to reveal man to himself, right? That we have forgotten who we are. We've forgotten what we're called for. We've forgotten our relationship with God, with each other, and ultimately even with the land, right? And so virtue comes as a corrective. And it's so beautiful too, because when you grow in the virtues, it actually feels good, right? You actually grow in happiness. It doesn't mean you don't suffer. Just like a great athlete who practices. We have this great quote. We didn't include it in the book because we were trying to get direct description, but essentially the story goes that Michael Jordan was in an interview towards right when he was entering and announced his retirement. And one of the interviewers said, "Hey, you got to admit, you're the greatest player that's ever played the game, and you have all these natural raw talents, and and like how much of this is natural and given to you, and how much of this is you?" And Michael Jordan could be sometimes a pretty confident athlete and have that persona, but his answer was really telling. And he said, "No," he goes, "I'm not going to." He goes, "Don't for a minute take away from the fact that I've been blessed with opportunities, with skill." With a body that can do things I'm even amazed by. Like, he credited it. I mean, he had this sort of like this ontological humility, recognizing he didn't make himself. But then he got really kind of got stern on his face. He goes, "But don't think for a minute that I didn't put in the work." And he's right? It's both. It's nature and grace. There's not a conflict between the two, right? Grace builds upon nature, and so this recognition. He went on this beautiful sort of soliloquy of all his time practicing, all this, and he says essentially at the end of his comment, he says, "My talent that I have been given by God would have been wasted if I didn't pursue it and do the work necessary." And like that, we have kind of forgotten that. I think we live in a culture of sort of instantaneous gratification. We live in a culture that sometimes thinks holiness is for the exceptional, rather than that holiness is actually for all of us, and we'll actually be happier and more complete and better people the holier we are. But these are all things that the hope is we would rediscover some of these things. And so in the life of the book, we try to give not only stories from saints and scriptures, but also just sort of little anecdotes from our own lives as well, just to bring this point home, that virtue is really essential for human flourishing. Virtue is essential for fulfilling our nature. And ultimately, virtue is essential for building the type of relationships that are going to lead towards our flourishing, not only in this life, but in the life to come as well.
I mean, what's beautiful about the concept of the book then is that virtue is this excellence for all men. So all men are pursuing this virtue and working on it, but what you look like as a saint, as you're pursuing that, it's going to be very different based on other factors, and one of those would be temperament. So just kind of and so you need both to become the saint that God created you to be, to fulfill that.
Yeah, and Thomas really is funny. In that section, I know Dr. Bella does a great job on this as well. But in this section on the Summa on virtues, and then he also brings it up too in Contra Gentilis and other writings of his. But the general idea that the virtues are dynamic, they're not static. They don't so much imprint upon us as much as we bring them to life, right? So there's this idea in Thomas that like we're not going to be a bunch of like monotone people walking around that somehow we're just robots. No, like God has created us in unique ways, given us unique temperament, given us unique gifts, born us into a particular place and time that are only known to His providence. And so this is part of the dynamic sort of excitement and adventure of really becoming the person God called you to be, becoming that saint. But yeah, these virtues are going to live out in really dramatically unique ways based off the individual and the opportunities they have. And so Thomas, I think, kind of elates in this, and in some of the some of his responses to his opponents in the Summa specifically, he brings out some of this language. So far from being sterile or cold, it's very dynamic and beautiful, and it's also kind of fun in some ways too. I I really enjoy the fact when Aristotle describes the virtues, he hones in on the, it's the average between the extremes. And you can have a lot of fun. And Thomas does a lot of this. Aristotle does a lot of this. Other Christian authors do a lot of this work too, in the East and the West, where they kind of look and say, okay, like if you want to grow in the virtue of fortitude, of courage, well, there's two components, right? There's the component that initiates action and then the component that perseveres. And pretty interesting that, based off your temperament, cholerics aren't going to struggle with the perseverance, are not going to struggle with the audacity, but perseverance might be difficult if it's not comfortable, right? Even though they're typically better, and a lot of times they naturally think they're courageous because that temperament comes easier to, though they still have to participate. But then, like, melancholics and phlegmatics really struggle with audacity. That's their challenge. When they want courage, they don't need perseverance. They can stick it out. They're naturally loyal. That comes easy to them, right? Which is also why they can hold a grudge, right? Just that's the negative side of it, right? But once they know that, if I need courage, I'm not asking for perseverance, Lord. I'm asking you for giving me opportunities to practice audacity or initiation. And the same thing for me as a sanguine. I stink at perseverance. I'm super ephemeral. I want to get on the next thing. This has been a game changer for me in my own life to realize that most of my struggles, even though sanguines are very focused on their senses, right? They're naturally motivated by people, relationships, by feelings. That actually most of the struggle is not actually with directing those. It's about sustaining the suffering that's required to direct those. It's really about perseverance. And so, Alex Savard does a great job diving into this particular component of Aquinas, where he talks about this. How do you sort of make some decisions in your own life about which particular component of the virtue you focus on, and then you can do the opposite too. So what's the deficiency of courage, cowardice? But there's also an extreme form of it, which would be rashness, right? And Thomas does a beautiful job, and he borrows from Plato, and Plato jokingly tells a story about a young soldier in battle who sees the enemy on the hill and runs into battle naked and is just slaughtered because he's totally unprepared, right? So. And he says, is this man courageous? And he says, no, this man's an idiot. This man is actually suffers from the vice of rashness. It looks like courage, but he had no preparation, no plan, right? He didn't, it was not guided by prudence. I mean, he goes this whole thing. And in that reflection, Plato talks about how, no, the good soldier will actually train themselves and then listen to commands to go in. They'll enter into the battle equipped, in other words. So, I think it's really fun to look at all the virtues and then say, okay, how am I personally called to grow in this virtue? And what does this virtue look like exercised by people throughout history? And all the great epic poems, this is what it was about. It's about the illustration of the sometimes the humor, but also ultimately the tragedy and vice, and the beauty and heroism in virtue. So I can go on forever about this, but the book is meant to start to reclaim that vision of virtue.
I hadn't really thought about this before when I was an undergraduate studying Aristotle, but the fact that every choice we make has to be for a good,
Mm-hmm.
So these virtues then, as you're talking about the mean and things, helping people to see, you can pick this good, but this is not the good that's going to ultimately make you happy. There's a lot of, or I'm inclined to run into battle without preparing properly. That's not going to make me happy. Well, I'm going to be unhappy very quickly, with that. So always choosing what a good, but being able to really choose the right good is really important.
Well, I think all of education previously, and I think this is a lot of what Kolbe Academy does too, is this idea of trying to restore the proper use of the intellect, right? And historically, we've done that for the trivium, and we understand the role of grammar and rhetoric and logic in terms of just using our human capacity. But this idea that every choice we make is ultimately a choice, we make because we perceive it to be towards some good. But if we haven't done the prerequisite discernment, or if we don't know or have discerned our particular state in life, right, or our particular mission, then we're liable just to fall on our face. And so it's important then that every choice we start thinking in light of this, right? The way that we grow in virtue is by making choices that are in proper order to the good, and then form that into a habit over repeated use, right? You are what you repeatedly do is what Aristotle tells us. And so I think just all this reclaiming this, and like I said, a big part of I think Tom and our desire to write it was because it's sort of fallen out of parlance, because it's fallen out of education, because it was so central to really Christendom when it was flourishing. We really do need to recover this, and so hopefully our book in some small way is part of a much broader desire from a whole group of incredible authors, many of that you've had on your program, to really reclaim virtue and then to do the work necessary to start to grow in it, and think about the way we make choices, think about our own prayer life, think about the way that we teach, all connected to are we living in accord with our nature, and are we in pursuit of those things that are actually good, beautiful, and true.
I'm just skipping back a couple of steps here, but I think it's really important for these times, like the author that you mentioned that said we'll eventually start denying our nature. And I mean, as your book's coming out and right around the COVID time, and you see people are trying to craft what they view their nature to be, or what nature ought to be from their own perspective. So kind of a returning to discovering what their nature is. And I always kind of like it because if you were an atheist who believes in evolution, you would still have to say man evolved in a certain way, so there are going to be a certain way that he should act in order to be in alignment with that evolved by chance nature. But yeah, of course, we have a much clearer view of created with a purpose in God's image and likeness, is much easier for us. But people have lost, certainly I think that prophecy was true, and now we have a need to kind of return.
Yeah, and the reality is, virtues are natural. So when we talk about the cardinal virtues, these are for all humans. So you don't have to have a religious perspective to understand that our intellect, we can either use it in accord with its nature or in discord. And it just happens to be that we're the type of being that when we use it discordantly, it leads to unhappiness and suffering. And we use it concordantly, it actually leads to flourishing, even if we might even be in pain, right? But we're making a sacrifice for a good thing. St. Paul uses this analogy when he talks about, mother and labor. But to recognize that the virtues are natural, right? The natural perfection of our intellect is making wise decisions. That's prudence. There's a name for it. It's even pretty amazing. Like in Oxford specifically, there's a guy who's a scientist named Andrew Briggs, and he wrote a book about this called "Science, in the Slipstream of Religion." And I happen to know him and done some work with him in the past. And he points out these sort of curious things where he finds these manuals for tutors and professors in Oxford in like the 1200s and like 1300s and but even like in the 1600s, 1800s. And you find it like up until honestly like 70, 80 years ago, sort of in the aftermath of about 100 years after the Industrial Revolution. But you find them telling them, hey, you're at the end of the day, what a good teacher does and what a good tutor does is it helps a person live in accord with their nature, and it walks through. And that the natural perfection of your intellect is called prudentia. It means making wise decisions, and it starts there. And like they kind of walk through with no religious language, right? So even this endures past the Enlightenment, past some of the atheistic revolutions in education, and still persists, right? Because it's just true. We have a will, and we are the type of being that exercises that will through choice, and choice that considers and is in unity with our intellect tends to have better health outcomes, both physically and mentally, right? Like so you can talk in kind of a dry, almost like secular scientific language about this. I mean, I think it's we don't need to, because we have the full tradition. We might as well take the whole thing out there. But virtues really are for every human. This is not a religious perspective. This is really an anthropological and philosophical perspective. We have an intellect; it's perfected by prudence. We have a will; it's perfected by justice. We have an appetite, and our appetite's kind of distinct. We have a particular appetite that goes after those things immediately, and then those appetite that goes after things that we desire far off in the future that we must wait for. And temperance is what moderates those immediate appetites, those five senses. And then what we call fortitude is that which moderates those appetites towards good things, or also away then from bad things. So it's like, for me, I get excited because even on a natural level, when I teach at a secular university or go teach classical philosophy to businessmen and women who have didn't come to hear a religious lecture, I give them all the same content. The only difference is I don't say St. Thomas Aquinas, I say Tommy Aquinas, and they go, "Oh, the guy from Queens, I think I know him," right? So like these truths are universal. They're written in the human heart because God made us this way, and so we have to rediscover them. Not only within our own Christian patrimony, but we have to rediscover them so we can share them with others just on a human level.
Couple of things come to mind. The sort of buzzword of agency that we have, like you're not helpless. Secondly, and more what I would love to hear you speak. I mean, I'd welcome your thoughts on that. But secondly, and sort of related, I heard you in a conversation with Jimmy Mitchell, who's also been on the Kolbecast. You guys talking about the importance of knowing oneself and it not being selfish. So could you give us a little glimpse of that? And I can link that episode so folks can hear that full conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's we live in a really strange time, and part of my own experience of this has been with my students, my undergraduate students, and they live in a world that tells them you can know everything about the natural world and about yourself. You can know everything, right? If you just have enough time and the right, special sauce or technique, right? The right technical knowledge. But you can know nothing about the spiritual world or about your own purpose in life. And so they live in this very sort of schizophrenic world where on one hand, they expect certainty where you're really probably not going to find it. And then they're told you can't know anything about those deeper questions, the questions we all have, questions of origin, purpose, and destiny. And really the nexus point for that is about a proper understanding of oneself. Knowing your powers, your limitations, who you are, your gifts, your talents, what's been given to you naturally, what came to you from experience or the school of hard knocks, as they say. And so I notice my own students, they expect to have a certainty of self-knowledge, like anatomically and like materially and physically, which is kind of silly to expect like that level of certitude. And they grapple with this, right? They're like, oh, well, but like I need to make this decision the right way because like my entire life depends on it. It's like there's pressure that way. But on the other side, they don't allow themselves to ask these much deeper questions of origin, purpose, destiny. What moves my heart? What fills my heart with joy? What breaks with sorrow? So on one hand, we have a culture that thinks way too much about itself. What do I need to eat? What do I need to show my friends? What's my social media persona? What decision am I going to make in my life that's going to radically, going to adjust the trajectory for all of my being and for all of my future, right? And so we are almost self-absorbed in that regard. But then we think far too little of ourselves in these much more important dimensions of our purpose, our meaning, our mission. This is something I've really zoomed in on in large part really because of the work of Alex Savard, who really focuses on this with business leaders and development of virtue for the purpose of fulfilling one's mission. This recognition that God has put us in a place and time, but He's also given us a particular mission, right? And so Jimmy and I talked about this idea that there's a difference between self-absorbed and self-disinterested, and sometimes self-absorption can be a tactic to not have to deal with the things you really should be interested in, right? So you become self-disinterested and self-absorbed at the same time, which I'm not a psychologist, but it sounds to me that would almost be like a little bit of schizophrenia, right? You're like torn within yourself. And so we need to come back to a much deeper knowledge of ourselves. And here's the reality, is it takes time. I mean, I'm 45 years old. There are still characteristics about my life and my behaviors that if I were not married to somebody I love dearly enough that she can tell them to me without me getting upset. Well, let me rephrase that. She can tell them to me with me getting only minimally upset. Right? I would not know these things about myself. Right? These are things that come out of deep prayer, relationship with others, having mentors, empowering other people to give you insight and give you correction and improve. Like all those things are necessary to really start this deep journey of self-understanding. The Pope John Paul II's favorite poet, I'm going to butcher it, Rilke. He says the only journey, or the only real journey, is the journey within. And it's within this beautiful poem where he's talking about the sort of self-discovery. And that there's a type of self-discovery that's not self-absorption, that's not self-disinterest. That's a real interest in how God has made you and your place within it, right? And this is also something that we need to recover. And part of eritology, part of study of the virtue is precisely doing this, right? Is, what virtues do I have? What virtues do I don't? What natural strengths do I have that if I participate over time, they'll become a virtue, right? There might be a natural strength, but not yet a virtue until your will and intellect are in partnership. And then what are those, vices? What are those weaknesses that if left unchecked can become vices? So all of this is about a really desire for the right type of self-knowledge. And so even now with my students at secular university, honors college, a class specifically on agrarian literature and writing the land, which is one of my passions and interests just on a personal level. This is what we're doing. We're having them ask questions about themselves. And very often I have to be in the position where I say, you didn't answer the question, right? You told me all the accoutrements, right? It's great. I know like what type of coffee you like, but let's just go like one step deeper. And what happens is a lot of people just have never gone there before, and it's very scary. Because either they feel vulnerable, or they feel they lack, using your word, they lack agency because they're not in control. But yeah, so I know that's a very long answer to a simple question, but the reality is that the virtues actually help us take a deeper look at ourselves and be more honest with ourselves. And there's this phrase that I can't think of the author right now, but it's called the Art of Leadership and Self-Deception. And the thesis is that most leaders do a horrible job because they simply don't know what they're good at. Or they haven't taken the time to say, hey, I'm really good at X and Y, but not good at Z and A. And so I need to hire people who can fill in Z and A. Like, modern American leadership, sort of culture doesn't think that way. So there's a lot of self-deception out there.
I think that self-knowledge is a bit frightening, frightening for people that, I mean, it's frightening for everyone, obviously, but especially if you don't have the faith, because we can, at least personally, I can always go back to, well, I know God made me and he loves me, and, I'm broken in so many ways, but there's some encouragement that, I'm still worthwhile, even though, broken and flawed. And I think it would just be hard to really reflect on yourself if you don't have this idea of like natural law, that I was formed in this way, and the faith, those things. It'd be kind of scary, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think Pope Francis probably says it the best in Evangelii Gaudium when he says, something to rightly stir our conscience is that so many of our family and friends live without the friendship of Christ. And he says, without meaning and purpose in their life. And there's some pushback from some individuals on that, and in some of the conversations after the release of the document. And they're like, are you saying that you can't have meaning or purpose in your life if you're not a Christian? He goes, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we understand how difficult it is to examine your conscience, to examine your hopes and dreams, if you're living in a way that doesn't have a North Star. It doesn't have this anchor point. And I think, nature actually provides a lot of that. And then that faith, superimposes itself upon nature to really amplify it. But people are living without both.
Yep.
Right? We live in a very confused world where even your own anthropological nature isn't allowed to communicate to you what yourself is. It's almost all virtually voluntarism, all your will. So much so, of course, we know the craziness, and I experienced it at a secular college, and most colleges these days kind of, and maybe they've always done that. They celebrate that unique period in life where you're searching and rebelling and trying crazy things. But the proportion of young men and young women who are not just questioning but rejecting their anthropology, and to watch some of the kind of baggage and thought process and real struggle that comes along with that. It was heartbreaking, and we need to be in a position where we have that pity and desire, and motivate true compassion. Say, hey, I want to help you, dive into these harder questions about who you are, and what it means, your sense of self, and that just takes time and relationship and love and effort, and it's true for all of us, and we're all trying to figure it out, right? So there's a great Scottish author who says, Ian McClellan says. It's so odd. Usually I'm really good at remembering all the authors' names, so I'm just forgetting today. But he writes, be kind to everyone because everyone is fighting a hard battle. Because the reality is the journey within is not easy. But we live in an age in which we have more things to anesthetize us to having to do that work than ever before. And Walker Percy makes this point back in his book in the 80s, or actually early 90s, in Lost in the Cosmos, which, if you do read it, definitely an adult book, not a little kid book. And it's all tongue in cheek. So he's writing it as a psychologist, as a parody of a self-help book. And he has these amazing, great lines about self-deception and lack of self-knowledge. And even has this great, he says, when did a festival stop being a festival and just become a party? And he asks this great question about the communal life when we'd celebrate. And he says, in festivals, alcohol was used to essentially increase the joy and the bonds of social commitment. He goes, now we use alcohol to anesthetize ourselves from the failure of the fact we don't know anyone. And so he's just like, he's very, very descriptive and very witty, but it's true. I think the human heart hasn't changed. We all have these questions. We all strive for happiness. In many ways, we all do want to live in virtue, even on a natural level, right? We want to reduce the vice. Everyone, St. Paul describes it beautifully, right? I do the things I don't want to do, and the things I do want to do, I don't do, right? And we've all, that's a human experience, it's not a religious experience. You can have a pretty poorly formed conscience and still realize that you make mistakes a lot of the time, right? And sort of, to recognize in the church has a lot to say and a lot to add to help us be better humans. And yes, by virtue of being better humans, being better Christians then too. You can't be a good Christian without being a good human first. It's just the reality. And so God gives us the opportunity to do that work. And we see this with the apostles, right? God doesn't suppress any of St. Peter's irascibility. Jesus does not suppress any of Peter's passion. What does he do? He uses that natural temperament of Peter's, and he pours grace into it, and Peter's disposed to receive it. And it's precisely the personality that led St. Peter to clothe himself and then jump in the water to swim to Christ, to do all these things. That was what was needed to be the leader of the church, right, in the first century. So God does not want to destroy us. God does not see us as a problem. As beloved sons and daughters, God sees us as his children that he's trying to train up into fullness so that we can be proper heirs of the kingdom he's made for us. And some of us get that right while we're still here on earth. We call them saints, but most of us will get that right, hopefully after a longer or shorter period in purgatory. But the virtues are part of figuring all that out. And the church proposes them to us because they're good and because they're true. And it's our job to learn about them and then apply them in our own life.
Wow, what a great conversation. As a way of kind of wrapping up, do you have any kind of final thoughts for our Kolbe homeschooling families and related, listeners any of our listeners really, maybe about the intersection of temperaments, virtue, and family life? There's so much to say there, and you've already given us a whole lot to contemplate, and maybe you can come back and build upon it. But any kind of final thoughts in that whole arena?
Yeah, I would say teach on virtue and create a lexicon around virtue. That we have conversations even in our home where we say that wasn't very virtuous, or that you didn't have a lot of fortitude there, or that was a really good example of audacity. Where does audacity? Oh, that lies in courage or fortitude, Dad. Like, to start creating that language, because the reality is a lot of the books they read use that language. So if you're reading any of the Greek classes, it uses that language. If you read any even of the British, if you're reading J.R. Tolkien and others, this is the language of virtue. So I think for parents to really imbibe that in their lexicon, so that children start to understand it and can identify when they're growing in virtue and when they're not, I think is really important. And we have that opportunity to do so in a more intentional way within homeschooling. And we have a way to do that more intentionally with the literature we pick to form the imagination, right? To form an imagination that's focused on answering those fundamental questions in life, of what it means to become the man or woman God made us to be. I think is really important. So take full advantage of the opportunity as a homeschooler to have those conversations and create that lexicon built around virtue.
Thank you for that. Our show notes are going to have links to several episodes that have come up during the course of our conversation, and of course to your book. Are there other links about yourself that you would like included where folks can find out more about you?
So they can always go to ryanhanning.com. It's just the website that keeps people up to date on what I'm doing. And there's also a family blog on there that's horribly outdated, but you can also see what's going on at the farm as well.
Cool. Okay. Well, good deal. Stephen, anything else before we wrap up for today?
It's been great. I love these topics.
Yeah, I'm the same way, Stephen. I can talk about all day. I love learning new things about it.
Subscribe to the Kolbecast on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss an episode. And let us know how we're doing by leaving a rating or a review. And as always, feel free to email us at podcast@kolbe.org.
Mary, our Mother, pray for us. St. Maximilian Kolbe, Saint Ignatius of Loyola, holy saints and angels, pray for us. Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam.